Okay, so now we're going to look at the Doctor Who, classic series Doctor Who, broadly in terms of three eras, colonialist, anti-colonialist, and post-colonialist, which generally tend actually more or less to correspond with the eras of the program that we see, the decades of the program that we see on screen. The series' earliest iterations, as noted above, was indeed broadly and for the most part unquestioningly colonial. The series' original protagonists were all white, with two scientists and a historian among their number, traveling to various historic and futuristic locations where the plot usually revolved around their interventions, largely for their own benefit, into local sociopolitics. The superiority of Western science is unchallenged, and Western interpretations of history are normative. Likewise, Western morality. The Aztecs is frequently criticized for having a plot in which the Doctor's companion Barbara attempts to change Aztec culture to one more to her liking. And more significant is perhaps the fact that her failure to do so is seen as a tragedy, paving the way for Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica. As Orthia notes, the rational gain entrance to humanity while the irrational are swept aside. This model is both deterministic and essentialist, positing an inevitable predestination for humanity in a Western-style cosmopolitan future. If you think of the Aztecs, kind of the positive note at the end is that Locke kind of listens to what Barbara says and walks off kind of away from his society to go and be a rational man, where Totoxl, who doesn't, is presented as crazy and mad and power hungry, and there's a post-colonial fan fiction out there just waiting to be written. It should also be acknowledged that sometimes the colonial narratives in the early series do become quite complicated. The Keys of Marinus, for instance, is arguably less, as Charles contends, a story in which the protagonists do the bidding of a white-robed patriarch against black-clad anarchists, and more one in which they find themselves struggling to escape from a variety of fascist dystopian societies. So in the end, the message of that one is kind of there is a system, you can't escape it, you can try to fight it, but it's going to roll over you, which is actually a really downbeat ending that most people don't tend to think about when they watch The Keys of Marinus. The Daleks' master plan sees the Doctor and Daleks fighting a proxy war against each other using a variety of human agents of varying degrees of willingness and self-awareness. Nonetheless, this sort of Cold War activity is still a type of colonialism, and one not too far removed from that practiced by Europeans in North America or India at various times. Given our case study, it's worth taking particular note of the Daleks. Loosely based on Wells's The Time Machine, whose colonial themes are frequently noted by critics, the story features two societies existing on the planet Starro: the primitive, peaceful, and nomadic, but beautiful and blonde, Thals, and the Daleks, mechanized cyborgs living in a city, who have an explicit doctrine of Dalek superiority. In order to escape the planet, the Doctor and companions must persuade the Thals to abandon the non-violent ways and fight the Daleks, essentially on behalf of the protagonists. This is presented less as a selfish act on the part of the protagonists, but as a necessary thing for all concerned. We are told that if the humans don't motivate them to fight, they will be exterminated by the Daleks, and therefore weaponizing them is not an act of imperialism, but something to be done for their own good. As colonial readings note, the two are often conflated. The story is further significant that the Daleks, particularly in subsequent stories, do not simply take the role of another alien race to be subjugated or uplifted, but instead that of a rival colonial power to the Doctors. They are as arch rivals and as such as competitors in colonialism. It's worth noting that the Time Lords don't get invented, as it were, till the end of the 60s. So at this point, the main voice of imperialism, as it were, is literally the Doctor. So, okay. The 1970s saw an anti-colonial period, which is generally critical of colonialism and criticizes its norms and values to some extent. However, while some stories do show post-colonial leanings, for the most part, the series is not so much about subverting or reinterpreting colonialism as it is about simply rejecting it. The repeated alien invasion stories of the Unit era, for instance, are firmly within the War of the Worlds narrative tradition of putting the colonizer in the position of the colonized. In more futuristic stories, not only do we have Orthia's unquestioningly Western technophilic cosmopolitan societies, but our point of view characters in such stories as Death to the Daleks and Colony in Space are still human, white, Western, and either scientists or from a scientific tradition. The two Peladon serials may provide a debate on the costs and benefits of joining interplanetary trade federations, but the joining of these federations appears to be an inevitable, if not always a good thing. Now, occasionally a degree of post-colonialism can emerge, and the reason why I put a image here from The Mutants is because it's one of those stories. It generally follows the anti-colonial genre of Doctor Who stories, in which the oppressed Solonians, that's him there, find allies in their fight against the colonizer, represented by members of the colonizing force. Back there, it's maybe a little hard to tell in this picture, but they're multi-ethnic. That's Cotton there on the screen left, who's Afro-Caribbean. Find allies in their fight against the colonizer, represented by the Marshal in the Dr. Joe, human scientist Sondergaard, center of the picture in native dress, and some of the more sympathetic members of the colonizing force. However, at the end of the story, the Solonians develop their own solutions, mutating into their final semi-divine form without assistance and exacting their own revenge upon the Marshal. Such incidents are not insignificant given how the series will subsequently develop. And one reason I use this particular screen grab is because, in some ways, it kind of brings this up. The Doctor and Joe are present, but they're at the side of the screen, and they're listening. You know, Kay is the one, the Solonian is the one who's speaking. Everybody else is listening. Sondergaard, although he's in native dress, is quiet and standing as a representative here, and the colonizing forces in the background. So in some ways, you know, this kind of sums up the post-colonial themes of the story. Okay. Now we get on to our the meat of our story. Charles argues that, not without justification, that under producer John Nathan Turner, the series sank into a kind of a toxic nostalgia, continually mining its own past and continuity in a misguided attempt at giving the audience what it is perceived to want. Charles proposes this is generally less a clever pastiche and more the sort of industrial postmodernism seen in the films of Disney and Spielberg, in which meaning eventually leaches out of the series and everything is just spectacle. However, Charles does tacitly acknowledge that the later series developed a sense of post-colonial awareness during Andrew Cartmell's tenure as script editor, otherwise known as the Cartmell era, singling out Ghostlight as an example of imperial satire, in which the angelic light attempts to preserve the past by freezing history, while the demonic Josiah plots to kill Queen Victoria, using the imperialist caricature Redvers Van Cooper as his instrument. As such, the story subverts the usual tropes of good guy and bad guy, and shows awareness that Doctor Who itself, beneath its platitudes, is about preserving the British Empire. Orthea, similarly, although she believes Doctor Who on the whole fails to acknowledge the material realities of an inevitable post-colonial world, shaped by exploitative trade practices, diasporic trauma, and racist discrimination, recognizes the Cartmell era as a rare moment in which such acknowledgement was possible. In particular, she focuses on the character of Ace, the Doctor's companion. Ace's whiteness, uniquely for a companion in any era, has explicit meaning through her time in the series. She grew up as a white child in Perryvale in an openly multi-ethnic friendship group, which we actually see in Survival, but whose Asian friend, Benicia, was attacked by a group of white supremacists, prompting Ace to vandalize the mansion she will later revisit in Ghostlight. And the image I've used here is from the moment in Ghostlight where Ace revisits that moment of revenge. At the same time, however, in Battlefield, Ace also shows that she has subconsciously absorbed racist language and tropes of white superiority. As Orthea puts it, Ace is neither purely good nor bad. She is neither the purely anti-racist hero nor the purely racist villain. She is a product of her society, and it is complicated, so she must be aware of and fight what society does to her. Ace cannot be colorblind in a world where race matters. Cartmell himself, in an interview, said, "What I was trying to do was to tell good, coherent science fiction adventure stories which were intelligent and modern, that didn't have any of the creaky old colonialist tropes. Smarter, more enlightened stuff, or so I thought." This sort of post-colonialism can be seen throughout the Cartmell era. Usually it takes the form of a subtle change of emphasis or role in revisiting familiar themes. In Delta and the Bannermen, for instance, the aliens who walk undetected among the humans are tourists rather than invaders, Even the titular characters who provide the serial's driving conflict are not interested in invading or colonizing Earth and simply stumble across the planet by sheer happenstance while pursuing their own interests. Paradise Towers is a Ballardesque absurdist satire in which a high-rise designed as the pinnacle of luxury and technological advancement is now an urban wasteland, home to primitive tribes made up of its former inhabitants, helpful technology now turned murderous. The Curse of Fenric addresses the Second World War, and furthermore does so showing us the Soviet point of view rather than the British. Subtextually, themes of homosexual oppression and female sexual liberation also come to the fore. Although the decade may have begun in a toxic nostalgia, by the end the series had thrown off its toxicity and was using the idea of nostalgia as a means of subverting and challenging earlier narratives, which takes us to Remembrance of the Daleks. If I can get this page turned. Okay, Remembrance is one of the best examples of a post-colonial story in the original series. Specifically, it openly reinterprets the Daleks in a story set in 1963, the year of Doctor Who's origin. However, this is a 1963 in which the colonial politics, which formed a subtext in the original stories, is now brought to the fore. While all the humans we see in the series' opening story, An Unearthly Child, are white, here London is shown as having black as well as white citizens, and a seemingly sympathetic character is exposed as a white supremacist towards the story's climax. Similarly, the colonial themes of the Daleks are highlighted by making the primitives who the Doctor manipulates not the alien Thals, but the humans of Britain, itself a colonizing power. Ace's assertion that the two factions of Daleks who have arrived in London are embroiled in a conflict over racial superiority may well be a misunderstanding, which the Doctor allows her to believe in order to manipulate Ace into acting as his enforcer. However, if the conflict is in fact racial, as the author, Ben Aronovich, has asserted is the case, then this mirrors how colonial activities frequently rebound on the colonizer, as ideas of ethnic hierarchy, evolution, and the undesirability of miscegenation form a feedback loop between activities in the colonies and at the heart of empire. It is not insignificant that Davros in this story goes from being merely the Daleks' creator and spokesperson come leader to actually being their emperor. The story also goes against the writers of the 63 series' intentions by casting the first Doctor not as a dilettante, universe-trotting scientist of admittably flexible morality, but as a plotting, calculating, and colonial force who came to 1963 London to hide a powerful device, a stellar manipulator called the Hand of Omega, which he later returns in his 7th incarnation to retrieve and use against the Daleks. However much this may be a valid or invalid reinterpretation of An Unearthly Child, and believe me, much ink has been spilled, the idea does work within the context of Remembrance, in which the Doctor's malevolent colonialist side is made explicit. Remembrance is a story in which the humans of the 1960s are caught in the crossfire of the three-way conflict between the Doctor, the Dalek Supreme, and Davros, which is itself complicated by internal notions of good, evil, and superiority. We'll now consider 3 excerpts, The Ripple Effect, No Coloreds, and The Doctor's Destruction of Sky.